Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. We're going to start off today's show by discussing Israeli politics. Benjamin Netanyahu, may very well be out of office fairly soon, if we're to believe all the reports coming out of Israel regarding Yair Lapid and his ability to then successfully form a coalition government along with Naftali Bennett, as well as, even interestingly, an Israeli Arab party called Ram, and a number of other parties as well. I believe there are 8 total parties in this coalition that has been formed and presented to President Reuven Rivlin at this time. Does this then mean the end of the political career of Netanyahu? Maybe that's an overstatement overall, but it's still significant because he has been Israel's longest-serving prime minister. What does this also then say about the strength of this coalition that has been formed? Because it is, when you look at it on paper, parties which possibly and probably do disagree significantly on a number of important topics. Naftali Bennett to extreme right, if I may use that term, and others who are more centrist and even leftist in some regards as well. Will they be able to make this work? And how then does Sean Foley, who is a professor of history at Middle Tennessee State University, is joining us now from Murfreesboro, Tennessee. We're also joined by Dr. Guy Burton, who is an adjunct professor of international relations at Brussels School of Governance. He's joining us today from Brussels. And we will also be joined from London by Dr. Neve Gordon, who is a professor of international law at the School of Law at Queen Mary University of London. He's also the author of Israel's Occupation. Neve, Guy, and Sean, thank you to all three of you for your time today. Sean, let me start with you, if I may. What do you make of this coalition? I mean, as I said, it does seem like it was just formed because they all agree on one thing, and that is that they wanted Netanyahu out of office.
That's one thing they all agree on. But also, I would argue that there are a variety of other factors at play. One of the most important things I should note is that the Israeli political elite has to prove to their society that they can govern. Remember, this is after multiple elections and the inability of the political elite to have a government or even a budget in the middle of multiple crises. And I should note one other thing to add to your introduction. The news noted this morning as well that the Arab Party may also get a deputy ministership within the prime minister's office. What that means or whether they take it or not is a different question. But that's a significant step forward. And I would argue the picture which showed the multiple leaders, including Mansour Abbas, signing the agreement and all smiling was an important political picture, one domestically for Israel, but also one for its foreign policy as well.
Guy, what do you make of this coalition at this time? One thing that really confuses me is that to have Naftali Bennett as well as an Arab party in a coalition government, I mean, to me that seems like, at least, and I could be mistaken, of course, that it'll be really, really hard to make this work.
I think it might work for a very short period of time because Abbas, the leader of Ram, is a pragmatist and he wants basically money to help his community. He wants recognition of the unrecognized Bedouin villages in the south. He wants the government to stop destroying Palestinian houses inside Israel. And he wants to channel money to the education system, the healthcare system of the Palestinian citizens of Israel. And so long as he gets that, and that there is not another war with Gaza or the West Bank or with the Hezbollah in Lebanon, and there is not other kind of circumstances, he will go along with this government. If there's some kind of external issues, or if he doesn't get what he was promised, he will leave this government and the government will fall.
Sean, let me go to you then. What do you make of the fact that now we have even an Arab party willing to form this or be part of a coalition government? I mean, this happened last time around, if I'm not mistaken, in the 1990s with Yitzhak Rabin. Is this a step forward in ensuring that the Arab population also has a voice?
Things first, I hope we get Guy on. He's someone I've worked with in the past and think well of his work, so I hope we get a chance to get him on. But second, this is a unique historical moment. The parties were aligned with Rabin, but they were not part of the government. it is difficult to overestimate just how important it is that Mansour Abbas has entered this government. And not only has he entered the government, but there may also be a ministerial position. And I think this shows a variety of things within Israel. It shows, first of all, it's a reflection of its political system and the multiple different factors and oppositional forces that play in that political system, including roughly 20% of the population that is Palestinian or Arab, but also there are Druze as well. And there are different politics among those Arabs as well, just as there's different politics among the larger Jewish population within the country as well. The politics, of course, reflects the fact that the stress on the political system, one of which we haven't mentioned, the fact that Bibi Netanyahu is currently under indictment on multiple charges. That's part of the pressure that's on this political system. The pressures also that Israeli society has had to undergo because of COVID-19. Issues also within Israeli society of enormous cleavages. We discuss often the cleavages between the Palestinians and Palestinians and Jews within Israel, or also within the larger Palestinian territories as well. But also there are significant divisions within Israeli society between secular and religious Israelis over issues such as LGBTQ rights, for instance, or also major issues, other issues as well, infrastructure within a society that's grown exceptionally quickly over the last 10 to 20 years. There are nearly 10 million Israelis now. It's 9 million Israelis. It's a country that's grown very quickly. Basic issues of infrastructure are problems. The political system, medical system, all of these are issues that have to be addressed on top of the other strategic issues, not only with Hezbollah and Hamas, but also the question of how they'll deal with Iran, and also the complicated relationship with the United States, a relationship that took a significant hit this past year. There were significant cleavages and criticisms of Israel within the United States, significant criticisms that Israel will have to address, particularly as they are now asking for nearly $1 billion to help them pay for the costs of the recent war. These are all complicated strategic issues on top of the new relationships they're forming.
Guy, if you can hear me, tell us about your thoughts, about the coalition overall. And I wanted to throw this in there as well. What does this then mean for the main issue? I mean, it always remains the main issue, at least from an outside point of view. And that is the issue, of course, of the occupation, the continuing occupation, blockade of Gaza, human rights, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, well, thank you for having me on the show, Waqar. I mean, it strikes me that, as you've probably discussed, what's really holding this coalition together is simply that it's opposed to Netanyahu, and it's because it's going across the political spectrum from the center left far to the nationalist right. There is very little to hold it together. So on things that are controversial, they won't try and push the agenda or push the envelope too far. But of course, the status quo doesn't mean that things stay silent. This, as you rightly point out, the issue of the occupation will continue. The issue of settlement building will continue. There may be a freeze, perhaps, for a while, but it will continue. We've already seen in the weeks since the ceasefire came into play, that police and security services have ramped up their activities, within Israel. The number of arrests of Palestinians has been growing, and of course, much of the focus of the international community has primarily been on the ceasefire, on what happens in Gaza, and not enough discussion about what's going on, within the so-called mixed cities in which, Palestinian citizens of Israel and Israeli Jews live together.
Yeah, so Neve, what are your thoughts? I know you've already alluded to that in your first answer there about the issue of Palestinians, but does this affect them at all? I mean, or is this just Israeli domestic politics for the sake of domestic politics? I mean, one does hope, though, right, that if you have a more centrist, I wouldn't say leftist, but more centrist leader in place, that hopefully means that there's light at the end of the tunnel?
Well, I don't think we have a more centrist leader. I mean, Bennett is surely not centrist, and he's going to be the prime minister in the coming years. and it's unclear whether this government will hold after that. What is clear is that we have a very right-wing government that can work only on issues that are economic, basically, and in that sense, it's also right-wing. It's a neoliberal government.
But Neve, if I may just interrupt a quick second, I'll let you continue. But I mean, Lapid is more centrist than Naftali Bennett, certainly, isn't he?
Yes, but Lapid is not going to be the prime minister for the Bennett is the first prime minister, according to the agreement between them. So what is interesting to note is that the Israeli public, the Jewish citizenry, has moved right over the past 2 decades, and that currently, out of the 120 Knesset members, I think we have something like maybe 20 Knesset members that believe in a two-state solution or something like that. The vast majority of Knesset members, including many Knesset members in Lapid's party, would not say it in so many words, but do want to maintain the apartheid regime that currently do not see any change or dramatic change in policy. I agree with the other speakers that what we're looking at is at the end of Netanyahu's reign, but we're not looking at any major shift in Israel's policies towards the Palestinians and in Israel's policies towards its own citizenry in terms of the economic and helping the poor and helping the deprived citizenry.
All right, so what are your thoughts? Let's expand on that, about the issue of the Palestinians, because as Neve there said, I mean, it would be fair to say, right, that Israel has moved ever more right over the past, in recent history, and that certainly is worrying, is it not, for any chances, any talk of peace or two-state solution, as we still know many Western nations are holding out hope for?
Sure. I mean, first of all, the point of what is just Guy and Neve have just pointed out about the issue of the Palestinian citizenry of Israel is a major issue. And it was an issue that was brought out during the recent conflict, where there was significant violence, intercommunal violence in places like Lod and others, that came as a significant shock to Israeli society, again, reflecting pressures. And it should be noted correctly that Israeli society under Netanyahu, who has been prime minister since 2009, has moved significantly to the right. I mean, look at a party like the Labour Party and other left-wing parties within the country, not nearly as strong a position. And I would agree also that in the near term, issues of moving towards a two-state solution will be exceptionally difficult. I mean, we're even talking about a government, let me pause for a moment, that hasn't had a budget, hasn't had a stable governing coalition. Part of what they're going to try to do is try to set up a government that can actually pass a budget and be a government for a significant period of time without collapsing. That by itself is an enormous challenge. But let me add as well, the issue of the Arabs within Israeli society is a major one. And again, Abbas serving in government is going to be an important issue. I suspect, again, he will be someone who will be used as part of rebuilding the political image of the country overseas. That picture, again, I mentioned earlier of them signing the agreement is part of that process. There was an understanding of what type of damage the violence that previously occurred during the recent war has done overseas. And that's going to be an issue. How do they deal with that intercommunal violence? How are they going to deal also with the trials and also that are also going to take place of people who are involved in what was horrific violence within Israel itself? Let me add, senior Israelis noted that the violence within Israel was more threatening in many ways than the bombs and the rockets that were sent from Gaza. Some people even thought of it as something like a low-level civil war. So part of this government is going to see, how do we bring those tensions down? How do we deal with that? It's an open question.
Indeed, and I'm glad Sean brought that up, and sort of Neve, about that intercommunal violence, as it was called, because there was also then, and if you can correct me if I'm wrong if I'm stating this incorrectly, that there was this unity seen amongst those who are citizens of Israel, i.e. those Arab citizens of Israel, Palestinian citizens of Israel, and those who are not, and those who are just within the occupied territories as a whole, or in Gaza, for example, that there was unity amongst them, essentially, or brotherhood seen amongst them when it came to what's happening in Sheikh Jarrah, what happened in Gaza, etc. That in and of itself would also then give pause, do you think, to the Israeli establishment? And does that then affect things politically going forward?
Well, yes, and I mean, just to sort of add on from what Sean was saying there as well. I mean, this is the consequence of at least 20 years of the rightward shift in politics, and Netanyahu's efforts at sort of dividing and ruling the Palestinians. I mean, one of the big challenges, of course, that now exists is that especially if you look in Jerusalem, there is no sort of organization or leadership for the Palestinian polity there anymore. So it's very difficult for Israeli representatives to actually, or the government to be able to interact with the leadership there, because it's very much now sort of a grassroots movement that's taking place there, regardless of Mansour Abbas's involvement in the party in the new government or not. So I mean, there's a real challenge here for in the absence of not just within Israel of the Palestinian citizenry of Israel, but also, if we think it's not that long ago that Mahmoud Abbas, the Palestinian president in the West Bank, cancelled the elections. And keep in mind that although he's done this in the past before, and his authority has remained unchallenged, this time round, there is real rumblings within Fatah, real rumblings within the Palestinians of the West Bank as to whether he should still be there. Keep in mind that his term of office was supposed to have ended about 15 years ago.
Indeed. We'll have to leave that, unfortunately, as our final comment. The clock has got the best of us, but we really appreciate all three of you for taking your time out of your, no doubt, busy schedules to share your expertise with us. We're joined there by Sean, who is speaking to us from Tennessee, Guy, who is speaking to us from Brussels, and Neve was speaking to us today from London. We were discussing there the fact that Yair Lapid has announced that he has successfully formed a coalition government. He's presented it to the Israeli president. That is, this will include the extreme right-wing leader, Naftali Bennett. He'll be prime minister first, as of course correctly pointed out by our experts, and that does then of course represent a significant right-wing tilt even in the Israeli establishment, political establishment that is. Nevertheless, the other parties who are part of this coalition government are not all right-wing. I mean, Yair Lapid himself is at least not on paper as right-wing as Bennett, but we even have an Arab party who is part of this coalition government. Will that be enough to bring some balance to Israeli politics, and especially to the main issue, which always remains the occupation, at least in my eyes, from an outsider's point of view, the occupation and the issues of human rights, etc., towards Palestinians, both within Israel and in the greater occupied territories. We'll keep a close eye on that, of course, here on Scope. I'll be back with my next segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. We're going to continue talking about the situation in the occupied territories. We're going to go back to what's just recently happened, specifically when it comes to Gaza and Israel's strikes on Gaza, as well as, of course, the Hamas rockets fired into, quote-unquote, Israeli territories. But we're going to look at this from an international law perspective, right? Because there is always, seemingly, at least in many discussions surrounding this issue, the missing context of the fact that, A, there are international laws regarding how Israel, as the occupier, is meant to be acting towards the occupied peoples, which it has, as we know, blockaded within the Gaza Strip as well, of course. And we know that Palestinians do, within international law, also have the right to self-defense, and that is a right which is given to any human being around the world in a case that they are then being attacked by anybody, really. It, of course, needs to be a proportional response, and that can certainly be debated. We can certainly debate if Hamas rockets are the best way to defend Palestine Palestinians, but nevertheless, we cannot take away the right to self-defense from Palestinians at all. And those issues are really, really important to discuss as they've come to light once again in what we've been seeing play out across the occupied territories just of recent. Let's discuss those issues a bit further. We're now joined with Dr. Triestino Mariniello, who is a reader in law at Liverpool John Moores University. He's joining us today from Berlin. Triestino, thank you very much for taking your time out to join us today. What do you make of any probes into Israeli activities when it comes to Palestinians, both at the ICC and just a recent announcement by the United Nations as well, that it wants to probe just recently what happened? It's always met with a lot of rejection on the part of the Israelis. What does that mean then about Israel as a responsible player in the international law arena?
Thank you very much for the invitation. First of all, as you correctly said, Israel has some specific obligation under international law and international humanitarian law as the occupier, and Palestine has right to not only to self-determination but also to self-defense. There is an ongoing investigation before the International Criminal Court just opened in March 2021 by the prosecutor, looking at war crimes committed also by Israeli authority in 2014 during the Gaza war in 2014, and also at war crimes committed against Gaza civilians since 2018 in relation to the so-called Great March of Return of civilians demonstrating peacefully against the blockade for the right to return to Palestine for refugees. So, what we know so far is that in relation to the last military operation is that, of course, the Commission of Inquiry recently appointed by the Human Rights Council will have to look at whether serious violation of international humanitarian law and human rights law amount to international crimes. But this time is different because this commission is established when there is already an ongoing investigation by the International Criminal Court. So, most likely, the materials, the evidence that will be collected by the Commission will be very important also for the investigation of the prosecutor. Of course, we have to wait for the Commission to see whether these crimes have been committed, but it seems so far that Israeli authorities have followed in relation to this military operation in Gaza the same approach that they have followed in the previous military operation. I'm talking about the Gaza War 2008-9 and the Gaza War 2014, which means, first of all, it appears that there is a reasonable basis to believe that war crimes of launching intentional attacks against civilians or civilian objects, so this war crime has been allegedly committed, and also the disproportionate use of force as a war crime as well in the statute of the International Criminal Court. So we will have to see what the Commission will, which will be the conclusion of the Commission, but so far it seems, as I said, that Israeli authorities have put in place and followed an approach that already in the past shows that international crimes are committed.
Let's talk, if we can, very, very clear to Israel, Triestino, about the fact that these Hamas rockets are spoken of more than Israeli attacks. And, whenever we talk about this issue, at least in mainstream media, it's always that Hamas rockets then led to the Israeli strikes on Gaza. Do you see it in that narrative as well?
Well, first of all, under international law, armed resistance groups, going back to the Geneva Convention, to the additional protocol to the Geneva Convention, and also then in particular to the resolution of the General Assembly of the United Nations, they have a right, not only states, but they have also a right to resistance, to self-defense and to resist under international law. Of course, this right does not enable any resistance group or any other armed group to commit serious violation of international humanitarian law, which may amount to war crimes, which means that also armed groups, like in this case Hamas, have to comply with international humanitarian law principles, so they cannot target civilian objects, and they have to make a distinction between civilian and military objectives, though these principles apply also not only to states but also to them. But as you said correctly before, we need to look, when we talk about these this military operation, we have to look at the context in which this military operation is taking place. And if I have a few minutes, I can just say that
sure.
The investigation of the ICC is looking at war crimes committed between two parties, but does not put strong emphasis on the context in which crimes are committed, allegedly committed. And this is a context of the longest military occupation in modern times in the West Bank. It's the context of a blockade or an occupation still ongoing in Gaza despite the disengagement of the Israeli Authority. It's a context in which serious violation of human rights and humanitarian law are gradually amounting to war crimes and crimes against humanity against Palestinian civilians, both in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, and Gaza are still committed, and hopefully they will be a part of the ICC investigation as well.
I wonder, Triestino, I was speaking to another Palestinian expert recently, and he's outside of the occupied territories. He's in the West as well, and he kept mentioning to me that it is international law where the hope lies for a just resolution to this issue of the occupied territories, of the occupation, etc. And many people are now advocating for, as you know, a one-state solution because a two-state solution is simply not reasonable. Is that realistic, though? Because as I said earlier, and as we know, it's not like international law is stopping Israel from doing anything. It does have the political cover at international bodies such as the United Nations Security Council by the US and other allies. So what hope really is there that international law can properly deal with the situation?
Well, of course, as we have recently seen, also in relation to the Gaza war in May, it's very difficult for the Security Council to take any decision as far as Israel is involved. I mean, because the US have used and will most likely continue to use the veto power. But the difference between now and the past is, and I want to place emphasis on this, is the ongoing investigation of the International Criminal Court, which is really an enforcement jurisdiction. It's for the first time international law can move from the theory to practice and can look not only at state responsibility but also individual responsibility. It's very surprising that states which are member states to the International Criminal Court are opposing to the investigation of the ICC. It's not surprising that the US are doing it or Israel is doing it because they are not state parties, but that countries like Germany, Austria, just to give a couple of examples, they are strong supporters of the ICC, or the UK, one of the main funders. They are opposing to the investigation. It's a huge problem for not only for the International Criminal Court, but for the states themselves, which shows a clear contradiction when it comes to support in relation to investigation in other countries, in particular in the African countries, but then they strongly oppose to an investigation when this concerns powerful states like the US in Afghanistan or Israel in the Palestinian situation. Now there is this possibility. At the moment is the only one. So it's and states, rather than opposing to it, they should, support an investigation. And just to be clear, the ongoing investigation of the ICC does not only look at the at the Israeli crimes. Netanyahu said that it's an anti-Semitic institution. It's not. So far, the ICC has been very reluctant to look at the crimes committed in that specific context. Let's look back at Gaza war I was mentioning before, 2008-9, or the attack to the flotilla a few years later. And it's looking at the moment at both sides of the conflict. It's also looking at crimes allegedly committed by Palestinian groups. So the court is everything than biased or anti-Semitic, as the former Prime Minister of Israel said.
Indeed. Unfortunately, the clock has gotten the best of us. We really, really appreciate, though, you taking our time out and for putting that all into context for us. That was Triestino, who's speaking to us today from Berlin, discussing the international law aspect, which is an extremely important one, certainly, when it comes to the issue of the occupation of the Palestinian territories, as well as human rights. And, I mean, the issues really are quite long if we list them out. The investigations that the UN, by the way, is carrying out, both through the ICC and the recent probe that it wants to carry out, they are being carried out on both both sides, on all parties within this conflict. So it's not like Israel, as Israel continues to claim that it's being targeted, it's not being targeted. It's all parties that are being objectively investigated. And there are criticisms of all parties involved, not just Israel, as Triestino there also mentioned. There are responsibilities on the parts of all. But yes, Israel does have special responsibilities as an entity which is an occupier, and that is, again, enshrined within international law. Really, really important to discuss these things out and to contextualize the conversation properly so that people really understand what is going on. I'll be back with my final segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. Now, in this final segment of today's show, we're going to continue to talk about the Vienna discussions that are taking place in order to try to have the U.S. come back within the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal. Now, these talks have been going on for quite a while now, and it does seem at some point that we may very well just be entering negotiations and continuing negotiations just for the sake of talking. And there doesn't seem to be much of a result coming out. However, an EU official has just recently said that possibly by next week there will be a resolution and that there may very well be an agreement on how the U.S. can re-enter the deal. As we know, Donald Trump had walked away from the deal during his tenure. What does this then mean? What happens next? I mean, a lot has happened since obviously Donald Trump walked away from the deal. Can this deal really survive in the current phase that it was in the current phase that it has, or will this be a very different kind of agreement? And then what does that then mean about what the Iranians are willing to give up and the Americans are also willing to compromise on? Of course, we know that this is not just a bilateral agreement, that this was a multi-party agreement as well, with other countries involved as well. Let's discuss all of that a bit further. We're now joined by Tohid Asadi, who is a professor at Tehran University. He's also the editor of the international desk at ISNA News. He is joining us today from the Iranian capital, Tehran. Joining us from Stockholm is Dr. Rouzbeh Parsi, who is the head of the Middle East and North Africa program at the Swedish Institute of International Affairs. Rouzbeh and Tohid, thank you both for your time today. Tohid, let me start with you. What is the mood like in Iran? We had Ayatollah Khamenei, who not too long ago had warned about talks for the sake of talks. It does seem like, though, doesn't it, that these discussions are just going on for the sake of talking?
Well, I think at least for the past 3-4 months, there is a kind of a strategic shift taking place in Tehran, and that is following not the same trajectory of going through long talks, but looking for a tit-for-tat practical, pragmatic strategy throughout negotiations. The thing is that when we're talking about negotiations, this is the very nature of every talk and every negotiation, that sometimes it ends up in an agreement over a night, and sometimes it takes months and months without any agreement. But the distinguishing point about Vienna talks is that they are not looking for an agreement, basically, but they're looking for ways to implement a previously, let's say, reached agreement back in 2015, and I mean JCPOA. So under such circumstances, Iran is going through the same trajectory of diplomatic way to solve the problem, with the consideration that the United States has killed the hopes of Iranians for the past maybe decades, after these long hours and weeks and months of negotiations, and after an internationally signed and sealed agreement, the country, the United States, basically started to unilaterally withdraw from the deal, and that made the situation really complicated. And now, when they are talking about negotiations inside Iran, either you're coming from a, let's say, liberal orientation or a conservative one, or anything else. The consensus, I think, among Iranians is that now, if there is an idea of basically going towards negotiations, there is kind of hesitation among all Iranians, and that comes from a serious lack of trust that exists towards the United States.
Rouzbeh, what are your thoughts on this? I mean, it certainly does seem like not a lot is being achieved here, if I'm completely honest.
Well, it depends a bit. We don't know the details because we're not supposed to know the details of what's been negotiating. And as the previous speaker pointed out, they're not supposed to come up with a new deal at this point. They're supposed to find a way back to the old deal. And again, the problem here is the credibility gap, and the credibility gap is primarily on the American side. That is, they're the ones who broke the deal. And so they've been trying to find a way back to the deal. But the problem, in a sense, has been that this has started rather late. It could have started much earlier. And the reason for the tardiness is, of course, because the Americans thought that they could wring more out of Iran by kind of continuing on the Trump line while negotiating. I mean, all the American sanctions on Iran during Trump are still valid and in place. And this, of course, did not work out. And on the contrary, I think it made the Iranians more exacerbated because they feel that the Americans are trying to use the situation for getting something that they're not supposed to have.
So, Tohid, what do you think the Iranians are realistically expecting to happen here? Because the outstanding issue, I would think, on the Iranians' part is that mistrust about, okay, even if Biden does re-enter the deal, there is no guarantee that the next president in the White House will respect that. I mean, that sort of back and forth dilly-dallying on this sort of thing, if I may use that phrase, will always remain this point of contention?
Well, I think just getting back to the point that your previous guests raised, when Biden administration came to the office, there was this kind of hesitation or supposition that there might be an air of change in Washington, and there's going to be a basically different approach taken towards Iran. But the truth of the matter was that Biden administration, practically speaking, started to stick to the same hostile, rancorous trajectory of foreign policy towards Iran that his predecessor did. So that was what made Iran really, basically, I can tell you, just Iranians lost their hopes. And there was this conclusion that either with Biden or with Trump or anyone else, there's going to be this hostile approach taken towards Iran. So under such circumstances, I think now if we can just summarize the whole idea of Iranian foreign policy agenda towards negotiations, is that first, we have no rush in Iran. So I can really feel that, because there was some claim that just due to the forthcoming election in Iran, there is going to be some kind of rush to come up to a conclusion or anything else. But as you know, the basic foreign policy, let's say, decision-making circle is not related to the presidential election, but related to a rather, let's say, deeper layers of power inside the country. So the decision made inside the country is that there is no rush either in Rouhani's government or in anyone else's government for the past years down the road. There is going to be no rush, and Iran is going to stick to a very basic claim, which is not the policy of word for word, but a policy of practice, and a policy of practice followed by practice.
Okay, Rouzbeh, we're quickly running out of time, so I'm going to give you the final word before I let both of you go. On the issue of the kind of pressure that Iran is under, right? So we can obviously talk about the economic pressure that has been placed on it because of that quote-unquote maximum pressure campaign that Donald Trump had enacted, and that very much still in place, as you had spoken of earlier. Is that enough to do you think, make Tehran bow to U.S. demands? I mean, certainly that's not happened yet, as Tohid there also mentioned, but one would think, at least looking at it from the outside, and that may be enough to make the Iranians compromise even more than they'd be willing to?
No, I don't think so. I mean, here again, as Tohid mentioned, Professor Asadi mentioned, what we're dealing with is a consensus. This is an elite consensus. So to some degree, there's going to be a consistency in the Iranian line, no matter who is the president. I would, however, say that if they had reached some kind of beginning of an understanding and a return to the agreement on both sides before the presidential elections, it would obviously have helped those who argued for this kind of agreement in the first place. It has not yet, and it probably will not reach that conclusion before the presidential elections, which is on June 25th. So in that sense, it will continue to give fodder to those who said that the whole idea of coming to an agreement with the US was wrong to begin with. But we also have to remember, both sides argue that there is no rush. The Americans claim there is no rush because, of course, they can continue to apply pressure. And the Iranians claim that there is no rush because they have a consensus and they are by now, in a sense, almost inoculated against American pressure. I think both are wrong. This is a game that they're playing. They both should stop doing that and instead just getting down to getting business done. Because in the long run, both of them very much need this agreement to be back in work.
We'll leave it there at that, but we really appreciate both Rouzbeh and Tohid for taking their time out and for sharing their expert insight with us. We were discussing there the latest when it comes to the Vienna talks, in which the U.S. is trying to seemingly re-enter the JCPOA. It's not a new agreement, as Tohid, of course, correctly mentioned there, that is meant to be reached, but is just a way, needs to be figured out, a path needs to be figured out for the Americans to re-enter the deal. To many, it would seem fairly simple. You just re-enter the deal that you left, but of course, a lot has changed regionally as well as politically for both countries ever since Donald Trump walked away from the deal. So this is proving a much tougher task than one may have originally expected. Sanctions relief, as promised within the deal, is huge for the Iranians, is a priority for the Iranians, and we'll have to wait and see whether and what exactly the Americans are willing to offer in that regard, which then hopefully appease the Iranians. Both sides need it, as Rouzbeh there correctly said, and would hope to see that both sides are able to then resolve that issue before things get any worse. I'll leave it there for now. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.